I did a project in which I analyzed the Holocaust through an evolutionary lens and effectively reached the conclusion that 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 Hitler was a monster, but that he was a rational monster, and that it is very important for us to understand what that means. That this was too easily dismissed as insanity rather than depravity of a recognizable kind. And
Yes, well, it's important to give the devil his due. And when you discount something of that magnitude, you risk failing to understand it. You think of it as a one-off in some sense. And that may be true, although it's not as if genocidal acts are one-offs. They're very common, unfortunately. You can make a strong case that there was something particularly egregious about the Holocaust, although there were 20th century catastrophes that were arguably of comparable horror, if you want to dare to compare horrors. But terrible things happened in Maoist China and in Cambodia and in the Soviet Union. And perhaps all of that wasn't undertaken with the blood-curdling efficiency of the Third Reich. That's part of what makes that story uniquely horrible. But I agree with you that discounting it as a form of psychopathology is not very helpful, especially when you think that there was a whole country involved, and more than that, really. So,
yes, I think I do think there was something special about the Third Reich, but it was a variation on a theme that is much less unique, and that, in some sense, is now a problem because, in my opinion, the only way to prevent these things from continuing to happen is to understand what it is in human nature that causes them. And that, in fact, well, all right, let's start with the dangerous argument, shall we?
God, yeah.
Here, let me talk by analogy. Let us just say that all of us, because for many reasons, are likely the descendants of women who were raped at some point in history. And we likely all carry the genetic capacity to engage in it as a result. But most men that I spend time with, I believe, are actually not capable of this. And they're not incapable of it because they're genetically incapable. They're incapable of it because development took that option off the table. And that there are a great many things in human nature that are like this, things that when we are born, the capacity exists, and then a proper upbringing and an environment that does not reinforce these things, or better, makes them disgusting to us, takes them off the list of possibilities. And I believe that genocide...
Let me add something to that, Tim.
Please.
You tell me what you think. Well, there's two things I think that take it off the table. One might be developmental history, and so you might say that there could be a biological tendency, and if it isn't encouraged, reinforced, or even if it's punished out of existence through inattention, even, I won't pay attention to you if you do that, or I'll punish you outright if you do it one way or another, it can't develop. But then I would also say that in a functioning society, the eliciting conditions for that behavior are also unlikely to arise. I mean, you see mass rape very frequently in wartime. And it is quite unlike normal male sexual behavior in the context of an intimate relationship, partly because it's often at least somewhat public, which makes it unique, because sexual activity among intimate partners is generally private, but in wartime it can be public. And so I would say that we protect ourselves against that biological propensity, that genetic propensity, partly through socialization, by bringing aggression under control, especially in its sexual elements, but also by structuring our society so that we never allow ourselves to go somewhere where those motivations are likely to emerge, and also where they wouldn't be immediately punished out of existence. But that can happen. I think you see those sorts of things happen in the midst of riots, for example, where a law-abiding person, a generally law-abiding person, will get caught up in the chaotic frenzy and find themselves doing things that they had perhaps never done before. I would like to think that it's a matter of socialization and a matter of regulation by conscience, but I do think that a fair bit of it is also brought under control by the stability and relative benevolence of the social surround.
Well,
So
I think those two things obviously fit well together.
now let me give you an example
Sure.
from the chimps. So chimps, especially the adolescent males, will go on what are essentially border patrol. They'll patrol the borders of their territories, and there's usually a couple of them, 3, 4, 5, a small group, and sometimes a female or two, but generally adolescent males. If they come across a male chimp from another troop, or it could be one or a couple, they have to outnumber them generally. They'll often react extremely aggressively, and really aggression without control. So chimps are hunters, and they'll hunt colobus monkeys, for example, which are about 40 pounds, if I remember correctly. And they tear them from limb to limb, and sometimes they'll eat them when they're alive and they're screaming away, and that doesn't inhibit them. And then when they attack foreign chimps, there also doesn't seem to be any inhibition of aggression whatsoever. It's there in its full array. But in their own troops, they engage in dominance disputes, and those will often escalate, but the rest of the troop gets upset and tends to regulate it. And so it's looking at that sort of thing that makes me afraid that it isn't so much socialization as it is our attempt to ensure that we always maintain ourselves in peaceful circumstances and we never depart from those places, not if we can help it. So hopefully socialization also matters.
Well, I would argue that these two things work together, that you have a very dangerous possibility, and that by reducing the amount of flammable material around and reducing the care with which one plays with the flame, the likelihood of a fire out of control is reduced, and that if you take away either one of these things, it goes up spectacularly. With respect to the question of rape, I would say you have the added feature that in order for a man to rape a woman, he has to be turned on. And so in some sense, there's an extra protection on the system that a man who has grown up as a boy in an environment that caused the idea of rape to become disgusting to him will not be capable of the act, hopefully. So we don't have that in the case of something like genocide. I believe we do need to make all of the various thought processes that result in warfare and genocide disgusting, so that people do not engage in these behaviors. And, if we don't, I suspect we will see exactly what we are seeing now, which is people playing with the very tropes that create this impulse, not realizing that in some sense there is a program latent within humans that, when activated, creates exactly the discontinuous kind of behavior that you see in chimpanzees when they encounter rival males. Right?
Well, and I think in the human case, it's actually the chimp analogy is pretty brutal, but chimpanzees are certainly exceeded in their capacity for brutality by human beings. And that's partly because, I think it's partly because, and this, it took me a long time to think this through, and I do outline it in all three of my books. There's a scene in Genesis where people become self-conscious, their eyes are open, and virtually at the same time, so the story goes, they become capable of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's a very mysterious story, but after thinking about it literally for a decade or so, I started to understand, I think, that it's a story about so what happens is people become self-conscious. They become aware of their nakedness, and they become aware of good and evil. They also become aware of their they're destined to work. And work is something that's relatively unique to human beings. If you think about it as uh, uh, delay of gratification, conscious delay of gratification. I'll give up something now, which is a sacrifice, in order to obtain something of more value in the future. That's one of the outstanding discoveries of humankind. The emphasis on sacrifice in the Old Testament, for example, I think is a it's a historical portrayal, a quasi-historical portrayal of the emergence of the idea of sacrifice, which I believe was first acted out before it was understood psychologically or explicitly. So you imagine, I do think in an evolutionary manner, and I take seriously the fact that life has been around for 3.5 billion years, and that there's been mammals for 60 million, and it's been 7 or 8 since we split from our shared ancestor with chimps. That's a very long period of time. Over that period of time, human beings realized that they could let go of something in the present and gain something in the future. And there's no way, you don't leap from the complete lack of knowledge of that fact among chimpanzees to the explicit ability to state it as a set of propositions without an insanely long developmental history in between those 2 points. And human beings learned over time that those who let go in the present, at least under some conditions, were much more likely to be popular, let's say, with their peers. Because if I'm a hunter, for example, I could share with you and store up my goods in the form of the favor that you now owed me, which is an extremely effective way of storing food, and a very strange way of storing it. We learned over time that people who were able to do that were more likely to survive. They made better mates. And after that, only long after that, were we able to derive that as a principle. Anyways, back to having our eyes opened. When we became self-conscious, we became aware of the future. Along with our awareness of the future came awareness of our own fundamental mortality and fragility, because that's associated with the discovery of the future. That also enabled us to put things off until the future. All those things happened at once. The thing about human beings that makes us so unbelievably vicious is that once I'm aware of my own fragility, deeply aware of that, I can capitalize on that, because I can understand that what will hurt me will also hurt you. And that means I can start to make an art out of pain. Animals, at their worst, they're predatory in a brutal manner. But human beings go way past that in their capacity for destruction. And it isn't only the capacity that we have because we are aware of our own fragility and so can artfully use that awareness on others. It's also that we have motivations that animals don't have too, like very complex motivations of revenge and resentment. And they're very, very, very dark motivations. And I think part of the reason it's so difficult for us to understand our own behavior in relationship to events like the Holocaust is that to really understand that, you have to look in places that are so dark that looking there is in itself virtually traumatic. And so people don't. And I understand why, but I don't think we have that luxury, unfortunately.
I would say that exactly. We don't have the luxury. And it's not that everybody needs to look deeply into those dark places, but we need to agree that it has to be done, that people who are capable of figuring out what's there have to be licensed to do it, and we have to avoid demonizing them for thinking about it and discussing it.